In this video, you'll learn different painting techniques so that you can add color to your primed and textured abstract composition. You've started with a photograph, you've cut out a viewfinder to abstract it, so you're focusing more on how line and shape and color and movement, rhythm, and contrast and all of those elements and principles of art are combined in here to create an interesting composition instead of trying to figure out, oh, you know, it looks like X, Y, or Z. So before I begin to paint with acrylic paint on this canvas, I have layered it with 2 generous layers of gesso. If there's no more gesso, I know that we're running low right now, you can use acrylic paint. White gesso is just like thickened acrylic paint, so grab some acrylic paint if the gesso is not there and brush on a coat once horizontally, let that dry thoroughly for about 10 minutes, and then coat another layer on vertically, and then let that dry for another 10 to 15 minutes, or just until you can touch the canvas and not see any white on your finger. So once you have that primed, and that's an important step not to forget, or else this spackle tends to just come off with excessive moisture, and then you have a big globby mess instead of a painting. I'm going to look at my composition here, and my first coat is just like the last assignment that you did, the realistic painting. Even though this is an abstract painting, we're using the same type of material, so a lot of it crosses over. I'm just going to create a glaze, and a glaze is one word that you'll find, a vocabulary word, in your assessment sheet. It says painting techniques utilizing a variety of painting techniques such as dry brushing, scumbling, distressing, and glazing to create a unique and visually interesting surface. So the first one I'll talk about is glazing, and that's when you add water to your acrylic paint to create a thin layer of paint. Your first order of business here is to get relative color, so match the color as best you can. It does not need to be perfect, and to cover the canvas. So you're thinking about value, light and dark, you're thinking about matching the color, and then keeping the proportions of the shapes down. So while I'm not trying to create a specific thing, so to speak, I do want to keep using this as a reference. Zoom in there so that there was a purpose behind creating my abstracted image. So I'm just going to keep adding water. You want to make sure that you get into all the cracks and crevices on your canvas created by that gesso, or I'm sorry, by the spackle or the plaster. Something that I'll be assessing you on is your level of detail and finish and your layers of paint. So while I will only demonstrate 1 to 2 layers on this video for the sake of time and your attention spans, or anybody's attention spans, I don't want to bore you with this, you do want to create more layers than what I'm creating. Anywhere from 3 to 5 layers is usually, rule of thumb, a good acrylic piece. I've never made something that after 1 layer I thought, yep, that's it, that's done, that's awesome. So while it takes a little bit longer, it will have kind of a higher level of detail, quality, and finish to it, even if you're not trying to create something from real life like this. Hopefully you've added actual texture, so that spackle or that gesso, or spackle or the plaster, in ways, directions that go with your composition. So here there are some, and it's very hard to see, but there are some horizontal lines, and those are easier to create on my canvas because I used my palette knife to create horizontal lines. I want to have paper towels on hand so I can just wipe off a brush to control the amount of water I'm putting on my canvas. It's getting a little bit too watery. Alright, so I'm nearing finishing up that first layer, just covering the space, getting rid of all the white areas. Another technique that I want you to try is called scumbling, and again, that's on the assessment sheet. But what that is a technique to get rid of any white spots that appear in crevices. And that's taking paint on your brush and then moving in concentric circular motions. So creating small concentric circles with your paintbrush to eradicate any white spots that may still remain after a couple of layers. So scumbling is also a way to disguise brush texture or to vary texture on canvas. So I have this started. By no means is it finished. I want to give it a couple more layers to build up intensity, to build up vibrancy and detail. But let's see if we can cover a few more of these. Let's see. Dry brushing is another one of my favorite techniques, and I would want to add paint to a dry area of the canvas. So this is the driest part that I have here. And I would also not want to dip my brush in water. I would want to keep this as dry as possible. I want to just get pure paint on it, mix up the paint so that there's no water. So you're getting kind of it's kind of the opposite of glazing here. Maybe get rid of some on a piece of newspaper, and then you're adding color without any water. So this is a step that you do a little bit more towards the end of this project. It adds texture, kind of gives a little bit of a distressed look. This brush is getting a little bit wet to do dry brushing, but just allows you to build up visual layers. Generally, I tell students to work from thin paint to thick paint, and there is kind of I believe in that. That's how I paint. But there is an exception to that, and that's when you would like to do glazing on top of a finished area. So let's say I was working this area up, and again, for the sake of time, I'm not doing it the same way that I would if I had all the time in the world here. But this is becoming a little bit more visually dynamic. Let that dry. I could go over this and then do my glazing technique again, maybe with a smaller brush. But again, that's adding water to my paint. Adding water increases the viscosity or the flow of the paint. It also allows me to create more of a controlled line or controlled form. Acrylic paint is a little bit hard to blend, but it does help if you add water. If you take advanced drawing and painting, you'll use oil paint, which is a lot easier to blend because it stays dry a lot longer than acrylic paint does. So sometimes acrylic paint is a fight against the clock, so to speak. So if I were to continue going about this, I want to work up each area of my canvas, at the same rate as my other ones. So now that I have dry brushed on this and added another layer, I would come and do the same thing to the other parts of my canvas. Ideally, I would be letting these layers dry so that the paint wasn't blending together as much. Sometimes I like it when the paint blends, but right now I don't really want it to. So checking your values, so finding your dark values, seeing where they meet up with your light values, and making sure that you're creating the same types of shapes that you see. the same amount of contrast. The last thing that I'll show you is distressing your paint. Move this over a little bit. It's starting to come together. There's a lot of glare. There we go. It's a little bit better. That's not better at all. Fluorescent lights. The last thing that I'll show you is distressing. So, because it's almost spring break, or at least it is for the class that's immediately watching this video, and you need a little bit of fun in your life, you can kind of go back to your childhood ways and use your finger to rub paint on your canvas. Depending on how much pressure you apply with your finger, you may take away some paint from the top layer and it may show through to subsequent layers. And this can be a useful technique, especially if your surface here is uneven, or if you're trying to portray some kind of like natural surface. Distressing works well on heavily textured areas. So does dry brushing. So my brush is relatively dry. I haven't put any water on it, and I can just kind of brush over the top areas here so that it creates a sense of visual depth, or actual depth as well. But if you look closely here, I can see the lighter areas here caused by an earlier paint layer, because as I'm dry brushing, since I'm not using water, it's only adhering to those top spaces and leaving the crevices a little bit different color. So that's a neat technique that you can use. You can also do kind of the opposite by adding water, increasing the flow of your paint, and then painting in some of those areas that are a little bit lower on your canvas, as well as using your finger instead of a brush. So this is about where I'll leave you. If you have any questions, go ahead and call me over, let me know. But this should be enough to get you started with your acrylic painting.